It was the kind of evening Oxford does better than any other city in England. The streets damp with a reluctant drizzle, the spires dissolving into a sky neither light nor dark, merely grey. I had sat alone by my window, a modest glass of single malt at my side, attempting once again to persuade myself of the pleasures of solitude. Somewhere below, a cat had crossed the lane, its paws silent against the cobblestones. And then, quite without warning, the bell began. It tolled heavily, not the bright, chiming call of evensong, but a slower, older sound, the kind that makes one think of stones crumbling and men kneeling in cloisters centuries past. It seemed to hesitate between strokes, as if remembering its duty. I knew, of course, that particular bell. Cloister College. Reserved for moments of finality, rarely rung at all. I paused with my pen above the crossword. 7 letters, definition obscure. I'd written one possibility, then rubbed it out, unsatisfied. The bell made my indecision suddenly trivial, though not without a certain irony, since life, like the crossword, is only ever a puzzle with too many wrong answers. Lewis would later insist he had not heard it that evening, though I never believed him. The sound carried, spreading across the city's damp roofs, past the carved facades, lodging itself in those who were listening. Perhaps only a few of us heard it properly. That is always the way with warnings. The whiskey caught the light in its glass. I wondered for whom the bell tolled, and remembered with a small smile how many poets had borrowed that line before Hemingway claimed it. My mind went back, oddly, to a conversation years earlier in the Sheldonian. A colleague had asked if I believed Oxford was still capable of tragedy, or only satire. I had replied with something careless, but the question lingered still. This evening's sound suggested tragedy was not yet out of fashion. By the third toll I was leaning forward, the crossword forgotten. There was no urgency in me, only that faint stirring which comes to a man who senses the beginning of a story. Stories always begin in quiet gestures. The light extinguished in one window, the scratch of a pen set down, the bell no one was meant to hear. When the telephone rang, I confess I hesitated. Strange had an unerring instinct for interrupting my evenings, and the thought of his voice, half officious, half weary, made me consider letting it ring unanswered. Yet the bell still echoed in my mind, and curiosity remains the most dangerous companion of all. Strange informed me of a death. Dr. Adrian Selwyn, Fellow of Cloister College. Natural causes, apparently. Yet the college had seen fit to telephone the police. A peculiar business, he said. I was to attend in the morning. His words carried no particular gravity, but the bell had already supplied it. After the call, I returned to the crossword, the unfinished clue, silent witness, 5 letters. I stared at it longer than necessary. The answer came, of course, but it did not please me. Too easy, too obvious. As with many things, the truer solution was elsewhere, hidden in a word we overlook. I closed the book, drained the glass, and allowed the evening to settle into me. Beyond the rain-streaked glass, the bell's echo still drifted, like a memory refusing to depart. I thought of the dead man, whom I barely recalled from lectures past, and wondered whether he had also heard it before his heart failed him. Some part of me suspected he had. Oxford rarely grants us such coincidences. It is a curious thing how sound can outlast its cause. That night, long after the bell had ceased, I still heard it as I drifted toward uneasy sleep, as if the city itself were reminding me that nothing passes quietly in cloisters. There is, in every college, a particular hush reserved for the morning after a death. It is not quite silent, for the clock still chimes. The birds still trouble the air with half-hearted song. But the corridors grow self-conscious, the footsteps soften, even the stone seems to absorb rather than echo. Cloister College, always a place of whispers and slow footsteps, wore that hush with uncomfortable familiarity. The porter had met me with the vague unease of someone who knows more than he understands. and understands more than he dares to admit. He had not liked Dr. Selwyn, that much was clear, though he would not say so. Few ever did. Brilliant, certainly. Respected, but not liked. The word had hung unsaid in the porter's tobacco-thick breath as we ascended the worn stair to Selwyn's rooms. There was something unpleasant about them, even before the body came into view. They were too neat, too composed, like a stage set awaiting its first audience. Books arranged not by theme, but by spine color. A single armchair angled too precisely toward the window. A bottle of claret unopened, its cork still sealed with a modest red wax. On the desk, the remains of a letter, unfinished. It was Lewis who said the phrase. Looks natural enough. He meant the death, of course. Not the man. Selwyn had collapsed beside his writing desk, one hand still grazing the edge, as if in search of a thought he had lost mid-sentence. His expression was strangely untroubled. Not the face of a man who'd glimpsed hell or heaven. Just absence. A body emptied. I crouched beside him, not because I expected to find anything. Pathologists have their uses. But because I have always believed in the power of angles. A detail often hides itself from the standing man. It reveals itself only to those who kneel. The half-written letter was addressed, though the name was smudged. The sort of smudge that suggests a pause, a decision unmade. The sentence it contained was short and brutal. I cannot be silent any longer. That sort of phrase is usually the start of something. Here, it had been the end. I noticed then, quite absurdly, that the calendar on Selwyn's wall was 2 days. Behind a man of his fastidiousness would never forget the date. Unless, of course, the date no longer mattered. The college doctor arrived in a rustle of cold hands and polite disclaimers. He spoke of congenital weakness, stress, and a likely cardiac episode. I let him talk. Men of certainty are useful in their way, but it was the unfinished crossword that drew my eye more than the finished post-mortem. I had seen Selwyn's crosswords before. He compiled them for the Clarion under the pseudonym Paracelsus. They were elegant constructions, often literary, occasionally cruel. But this one had irritated him, I think. A clue, 10 across, read, a scholar's confession, perhaps. 8 letters. He had left it blank. Later, back in my office, I would try several answers. Admission fit, but felt wrong. Exposure seemed melodramatic. Only much later did the right word arrive, not by logic, but by instinct. I wrote it down quietly and did not speak it aloud. Lewis, ever loyal in his gentle bewilderment, suggested the man had simply lost his footing with age, that perhaps the bell had tolled for the natural conclusion of a natural life. Perhaps. But there is something unconvincing about tidy deaths in tidy rooms, especially when a man known for precision leaves his calendar behind and his letter undone. I left the college in a mist that had begun to silver the stones. The river nearby was quiet. Only the faintest ripple disturbed its surface. Yet I felt, in the back of my mind, the first stirrings of a disturbance deeper down. Not a wave, not yet, but a change in pressure, a tremor of meaning beneath the calm. Cloister College has always carried itself like a cathedral of secrets. Not in the way of espionage or scandal, at least not openly, but in the manner of places where truth is folded tightly and shelved among rare volumes no one borrows. It is a college built not for light, but for silence. Even its trees seem to whisper only to each other. Lewis walked beside me with that careful tread he reserved for what he called the posher colleges, wary of saying the wrong thing or, worse, the right thing too plainly. He said he'd heard Cloister had once refused to install electric lighting in the fellows' rooms until a don broke his ankle finding the gas tap. I told him tradition rarely concerns itself with consequences. We met the dean first, Wilfred Harker, a man who wore authority like an old overcoat, not without weight, but somehow shabby at the seams. He offered condolences and administrative efficiency in equal measure. Adrian was a man of uncompromising intellect, he said. A stern phrase, I thought. Not beloved, not mourned, just uncompromising. The other fellows gathered with polite reluctance in the senior common room, a space that smelled faintly of burnt toast, dust, and the distant ghosts of port. The furniture had that particular worn indifference Oxford specializes in, not threadbare exactly, but confident in its own disrepair. Professor Helena Raines sat beside the window, legs crossed with something too angular to be poise. She greeted me with a nod that felt like a closing door. Brilliant, caustic, sharp-eyed in the way of people who expect betrayal and prepare their vocabulary accordingly. I asked about Selwyn. She smiled without amusement. Adrian was not a man who inspired affection. But then, neither am I. Thomas Everett arrived late, with hair slightly damp and an apology rehearsed to perfection. Young for a fellow, clever in that weary-eyed way that suggests too many debts and not enough sleep. He spoke warmly of Selwyn, though the warmth cooled when asked about the week before. I noticed he referred to Selwyn in the past tense with surprising ease, as though death had tidied things rather than unraveled them. Then there was Margaret. Not a fellow, of course, but his sister. She had been summoned, reluctantly it seemed, from a stone cottage somewhere outside Woodstock. She stood by the fireplace, gloved still, though the room was warm enough. Her grief had the dignity of distance. She called Adrian my brother, never Adrian, as if she preferred not to summon him too closely into the room. It was Lewis who asked whether Selwyn had seemed different lately. They hesitated, that soft, rehearsed kind of academic hesitation which fills the space without offering substance. I noted that none of them had seen him in the last 48 hours. None of them had asked why. The porter confirmed it later. Selwyn kept to himself. Meals in his rooms. A note on the lodge table when needed. Not unusual. Just undisturbed. I passed through the college library before we left. No real reason. Habit, perhaps. The hush of it appealed to me, the way the dust hovered in shafts of weak light from windows too high to see through. I paused by a shelf of Horace, remembered the misquoted line in Selwyn's unfinished letter. There it was. Pallida mors equo, pulsat pede pauperum tabernas regumque turres. Pale death knocks equally at the huts of the poor and the towers of kings. Selwyn had inverted it, intentionally or not. It stayed with me, that reversal, as if death in his case had not knocked at all, but crept in unannounced and took a seat in the armchair. As we left, the cloister bell struck the hour. It no longer startled, but I felt it settle in the chest, low and sonorous. Cloister College, like the dead man it had housed, spoke in codes, not secrets, not lies, just half-truths folded quietly into ancient stone. It was the sort of morning Oxford never apologizes for. Low cloud hanging like a tired curtain, the scent of old paper and cold stone drifting from the lanes. I found myself staring at the crossword again, as though it might speak if stared at hard enough. It didn't, of course. But that never stops a man from trying. The page was creased where I'd folded it the night before, the ink slightly blurred from a careless splash of whiskey. Or perhaps rain. The clue that troubled me most had nothing to do with the case. 7 down. Truth concealed within silence. 5 letters. I'd penciled in a lapse the evening before, though something in it unsettled me. Not wrong exactly, but insufficient. Back at the station, Lewis handed me a thin file with the kind of expression he reserved for moments he thought might matter. He said the college had sent over Selwyn's timetable. Sparse, unsurprisingly, but there was a peculiarity in the rhythm of it. 2-hour gaps, repeating same days, same times. Tutoring, they said. Private supervision. No names offered. The kind of answer that often suggests the truth is someone else's problem. Selwyn's rooms had been cleared, or rather, gently curated. The college had allowed me one last look, though it was clear they preferred the matter resolved, preferably with as few ripples as possible. Oxford dislikes disturbance, even in death. Especially in death. His desk was as I remembered it, though someone had straightened the papers, as if neatening a lie. The crossword was still there. Not the one in my pocket, but the one left unfinished beside the armchair. Selwyn's own. The grid is half complete, a few entries sharp, others tentative. But it was the ink that caught me. Different pens, different pressure. A man as meticulous as Selwyn would not have changed pens mid-puzzle. And yet 3 entries in darker ink, firmer hand. One of them, ordeal endured in quiet disgrace. 6 letters. The answer, exam, Latin, a test, but also a confession. Lewis appeared in the doorway, coat still damp. He said the coroner had no cause to doubt the diagnosis. Natural causes. Heart. The machinery had simply given out. I asked if they'd checked for digitalis. He blinked. Said there was no prescription on file. No signs of poisoning. Exactly, I said. No signs. It wasn't suspicion. Not yet. Just that whisper of doubt that follows when a man with every reason to keep going suddenly stops. Selwyn had been on the verge of something. The unfinished letter, the scheduled meetings, the crossword left defiant on the armrest. He hadn't planned to die. I stood for a long time in his rooms. Longer than necessary. There was a photograph, just barely visible beneath a stack of lecture notes. 4 people. Younger. Selwyn among them, smiling, or something near to it. The others, less distinct. One might have been Harker, perhaps Rains. I didn't move the notes. Some things prefer to stay half-seen. As we walked back through the quad, Lewis remarked that the place gave him the shivers. Said it felt like nothing ever changed. I told him the dead don't always need to speak. Sometimes they just leave clues in ink. That night, I returned to my own crossword. The clue about the truth still waited, and then it came, a word I hadn't considered. Liege. Truth within silence. Allegiance concealed. I circled the word and poured another drink. Some answers don't reveal themselves because we're not ready to see them, not yet. The trouble with whispers is they arrive too late to be useful and too early to be trusted. It was a porter, of course. They always know more than they pretend not to. Who mentioned the name? A Miss Claire Morton, visiting academic, literature. Something continental. French or Italian, he thought. Said he'd seen her leaving Selwyn's staircase late on several occasions. Always alone, always unsmiling. There is a kind of precision to that sort of observation I've learned not to ignore. I found her in the reading room of the Taylorian, the one with windows that never open properly and the ceiling that listens. She was seated by a bust of Dante, of all people, her long fingers turning the pages of something printed before she was born. I introduced myself without ceremony. She looked up slowly, as if emerging from underwater. She had that particular clarity of the academically gifted. Not brilliance, but sharpness, an economy of attention. She knew who I was before I'd spoken. I asked when she had last seen Dr. Selwyn. She closed her book with the quiet authority of someone who resents intrusion but tolerates it for the sake of accuracy. Last week, she said. Tuesday. They had spoken about a passage in Inferno, the one where Dante meets those who kept secrets too long. I remembered the canto, though not the line. I asked whether they were close. She said it depended on how one defined closeness. He had admired her work, had offered advice, had quoted Catullus when he thought she wasn't listening. She said it without irony. I believed her. There was something in the way she spoke of him that disturbed me. Not warmth, exactly, nor regret. A kind of unfinishedness, as though whatever had passed between them still lingered in the margins. She asked if I believed he had taken his own life. I told her I believed in complications. She smiled, faintly. Said Selwyn had been full of contradictions. I asked if she'd read the letter. She didn't flinch, simply said no. But her pause came a fraction late. I left her with her Dante and her silence, but the image stayed with me. A young woman reading the dead with more care than she had given the living. Later that afternoon, Lewis returned with a guest book from Cloister's lodging house. Selwyn had signed in a visitor 2 Thursdays prior. The entry read simply, M. Rossi, no address, no time noted. The name felt fabricated, too neat in its construction, like an answer inserted after the puzzle had already been solved. I remembered Claire's book, Marginalia in Italian. Rossi was a common surname, but not a common answer. The librarian confirmed that Selwyn had reserved several volumes on Petrarch and exile in the preceding weeks. I asked if anyone else had requested the same. Just Miss Morton, he said. She'd wanted the originals, not the translations. It was enough to prod something loose. That night, over a solitary drink, I returned again to the crossword. Selwyn's, not mine. The entry he had completed in a firmer hand than the rest. Exam. In medieval literature, an exam was not just a test, but a reckoning, an interior inquest. A soul laid bare. I wondered who had administered his, or whether perhaps he had hoped someone would. The rain returned after midnight, soft against the panes. The sort of rain that never quite reaches the ground, but hovers in the air like a held breath. In Oxford, affairs were rarely affairs in the romantic sense. They were collisions, of intellect, of longing, of principle, and when they ended, they left behind not broken hearts, but unfinished sentences. The older libraries of Oxford do not simply contain books. They absorb them. The walls remember. The floors creak not from wear, but from memory. The Bodleian bears the grandeur of its fame, the Radcliffe its curvature and pride, but it was the Cloister College Library that carried something quieter, something closer to the breath of the dead. I stepped inside just after 4, the sky already beginning to lose color. The porter had unlocked it without much enthusiasm, muttering that Dr. Selwyn had kept odd hours and odder company. I nodded, though I suspected the books had been his only consistent companions. The smell struck first. Not the musty decay one expects, but the dry, clipped scent of paper that has been handled without love. Only reverence. Reverence, I've found, is colder than affection. The shelves rose without pretense, each spine turned away from light, all alphabetical logic sacrificed to arcane systems and intellectual whim. A ladder stood forgotten against the south wall, and I remembered hearing once that Selwyn had fallen from it years ago, not far, not fatally, just enough to be reminded of gravity. I moved slowly, not because I expected to find anything, but because libraries require slowness. You do not search, you allow. His desk was in the far corner, behind a semicircle of poetry. Milton, Donne, the usual. The chair was lower than it should have been, as if it had sunk incrementally under the weight of time. I ran a finger along the edge of the desk. Smooth, worn. The kind of wear that comes from habit rather than activity. There was a slip of paper beneath the blotter. One line in Selwyn's familiar, angular hand. Et in Arcadia ego. The dead speak even in paradise. Beside it, a volume of Horace. The Odes, 2nd book. One line underlined lightly. Pallida mors equo, pulsat pede pauperum tabernas regumque tures. Pale death. I had seen it before, in his letter, misquoted. But it wasn't the misquote that caught me. It was the inscription on the inside cover. To A, from W. As agreed, no further debts. The ink was faded, the style formal. W for Wilfred. The Dean. A note of financial transaction disguised in the language of books. Or something simpler. A pact between friends now. Distant Lewis arrived then, damp from the mist, carrying a folder as though it might explode. He said the bursar had confirmed an unusual request from Selwyn. 2 weeks prior, he had asked to review the college's restricted archive logs. Not books, not manuscripts, access records. It was out of character, Lewis said. I agreed, though what character truly means in men like Selwyn is often a matter of convenience. We lingered. Something about the place refused to let us go quickly. I noticed, in a drawer left slightly ajar, a discarded library card. Older format, cardstock, edges frayed. Selwyn's handwriting again, but the borrower's name wasn't his. Claire Morton. She had requested a volume on Petrarch. I pulled it from the shelf, third down in the middle stack. Inside, more marginalia, mostly in Italian, but one annotation stood apart. A date, nothing more. Written in English, 21st October, the day before Selwyn died. I slid the book back. On our way out, I asked Lewis whether he believed the dead could leave breadcrumbs. He said he wasn't sure, but they certainly made better readers than the living. Outside, the wind had picked up. The Cloister Bell had not rung since the night it startled the city. But even in its silence, the library echoed. Some places are not haunted by ghosts, only by things left half-read. There's a kind of satisfaction in being wrong. Not the reckless sort that invites defeat, but the quieter kind. The kind that walks beside you like an old friend, whispering that your certainty was always a little vain. I had allowed myself briefly to believe the pieces were beginning to align. They always do at first. That's the danger. Certainty arrives too early in Oxford. It was Lewis who found the discrepancy. A payment made from Selwyn's account, small but regular, to a bank in Reading under the name of T. Everett. He stood in my doorway, file in hand, a kind of cautious triumph on his face. Said it looked like hush money. Said Everett had gambling debts, horse racing apparently. Never large wins, just the steady hum of failure. I remembered Everett's eyes, quick to dart, slow to land. Charming, but not easily, a man who had practiced it. We brought him in, not to the station, but to one of those anonymous college rooms with dust in the corners and chairs too old to protest. He denied everything, of course. Said the payments were a loan Selwyn had offered, unsolicited. Said he had always repaid in kind, marking papers, research errands, that sort of thing. Said Selwyn had trusted him. I asked whether Selwyn had threatened to withdraw that trust. He hesitated, said nothing, which is a kind of answer. Lewis pressed harder than usual. I let him. Everett looked smaller with every word. Not guilty, just exposed. He had the brittle poise of someone who has balanced too long on things not meant to hold weight. Eventually, he broke. Not in confession, but in tone. Said Selwyn had become erratic, paranoid. Talking about betrayal, about things buried that ought to stay buried. Said he'd mentioned a letter. Said he was going to send it to the college council. A letter I had already seen. Unfinished, unsent, and still folded beside his body like an accusation that hadn't yet learned to speak. I wanted to believe it then. The debts, the pressure, the threat, it all aligned too neatly, like a crossword filled just fast enough to feel clever. That night I stayed late in my office, rain fretting at the window panes, the room growing colder as the hour lengthened. I had Selwyn's crossword before me again, the one with exam and liege scrawled in different hands. I looked at the clue again, a scholar's confession perhaps. 8 letters. Everett might have confessed of a kind, but the answer still refused me. Then something turned, not in the case, but in the phrasing. Confession, scholar, 8 letters. I tried to disclose. Fit just barely, but too eager, too open. I thought, instead of the library, the book with the note. As agreed, no further debts. What if the debts weren't Everett's? What if they belonged to someone else? Someone not indebted in money, but in silence. I crossed out disclose and wrote palinode. A retraction. a second poem written to take back the first. Selwyn, the classicist, would have liked that. It was wrong, of course. In the grid. But not in the logic. The crossword wasn't a puzzle, it was a mirror. And what I had seen in Everett, that neat collapse into guilt, had only shown me the shape of something else. Not the answer. Just the echo of one. Outside the rain thickened, inside the whiskey thinned. I was beginning, reluctantly, to believe that this wasn't Everett's story after all. He was merely holding the pen for someone else. Motives, I've come to believe, are rarely what they appear to be. A man kills for money, they say. A woman for love. Both are lazy explanations, rehearsed too often in police training rooms and cheap paperbacks. In truth, people act for reasons they don't entirely understand. Echoes of old humiliations, the ache of being overlooked, the need to correct a story that once embarrassed them. I returned to Professor Raines not because I thought she had killed Selwyn, but because I didn't believe she had wanted to. She received me in her rooms overlooking the Fellows' Quad, the windows half fogged from the radiator's unconvincing warmth. The curtains had been drawn back just enough to let the grey in, but not the view. She was correcting essays. I remember that. Neat stacks arranged beside a mug of untouched tea. Her pencil moved slowly, as though aware of my presence but unwilling to acknowledge it just yet. I said nothing. Silence has its uses. Eventually, she said she'd expected me. I asked what she remembered of Selwyn's final weeks. She said he had been quieter than usual, that the usual edge to his voice had dulled. She had imagined. Hoped, perhaps, that he was finally losing the appetite for games. I told her I had seen the letter. She said she hadn't, said she didn't want to. Her eyes flickered then, but not with fear, with restraint. I asked if she regretted what had passed between them. She smiled thinly, said regret was a luxury afforded only to the naive. She admitted they had once been close, academically, ideologically, briefly romantically, but Selwyn, she said, had no gift for sincerity, only argument, and even that had begun to bore her. I asked about the old college photograph, the one tucked beneath his papers. Her name had not been written on the back, but I had recognized the jawline, the posture that implied a readiness to be misread. She waved it off, said college photographs always implied more than they contained. But there was something else. Something she said and then tried to retract with silence. She referred to the weather the night he died, said it had been too warm for October, but it hadn't. It had rained. I said nothing, only watched her hands. She noticed, of course, said she had simply misremembered. A woman like Raines does not misremember the weather, especially not when it changes the shape of an alibi. Lewis later told me she had been giving a lecture the evening Selwyn died, a well-attended one, apparently, on medieval concepts of penance and public shame. I almost smiled at that. The subject had a poetic neatness to it, but poetry, unlike truth, tends to resolve itself. That evening I returned once more to Selwyn's crossword, the one with the altered entries. One clue had bothered me for days. What follows a buried truth? 6 letters. I had tried a secret, then the riddle, then answer. None quite fit. But then, in the quiet, another word offered itself. Regret, a word with no absolution in it. Professor Raines had known something. Perhaps not the method, perhaps not even the timing, but enough. Enough to cause a man like Selwyn to write a letter, and then to leave it unfinished. Outside, the quad had darkened again. The lamps flickered on, one by one, as though remembering their function only reluctantly. The motive, if it existed, was not in anger. It was in memory, in old wounds that had never been allowed to scar. And that, I suspected, was reason enough. It's a peculiar thing how the past waits, not with patience exactly, nor with malice, simply with certainty. It never hurries, never jostles for attention, but it watches, and when the present grows thin enough, it steps through. That morning, the rain had lifted, though the streets still glistened. I found myself walking not toward the college, but past it, into a part of Oxford that changes nothing and remembers everything. A row of Georgian houses near Merton, one of them converted now into a private archive, the sort that requires letters of introduction, gloves to turn the pages, and silence more sacred than most churches. It had been Lewis, almost by accident, who'd mentioned the college's last public scandal. Some decades past, an unpublished will, a row over an inheritance, a benefactor's dying intention was twisted or concealed. The details had been smoothed over with the usual grace. Scholarships renamed, portraits rehung, trustees reshuffled. But the names lingered. Harker, Raines, Selwyn, and one other, Margaret. Not Selwyn's sister by birth, as she claimed, but by choice or convenience. The records were thin, but the language between them said enough. The photograph in Selwyn's drawer made more sense now. 4 faces, young, unreadable. Selwyn with a hint of uncertainty behind the glasses. Raines with that same austere defiance she wore still. Harker is not yet resigned to compromise. And Margaret, standing slightly apart, as if unsure whether she belonged or merely wished to. The will itself, or what survived of it, had been contested. The benefactor, a retired Latinist, had left a sum to establish a fund for disadvantaged scholars, but a second draft, unsigned, redirected it to one individual. The note beside it read, "The one who kept silence longest." Selwyn had been the last of them, and the silence had cost him. I returned to Cloister just before dusk. The college was quieter than usual. Even the porter's log had gone untouched, as if the very act of recording felt intrusive. I passed through the quad and up the stone stairs to Selwyn's rooms again. The desk remained as we had left it, but on the mantel, overlooked or perhaps misplaced, I noticed something new. A small envelope pressed beneath a volume of Larkin. No address, no date. Inside, a single sheet, typed, formal, a letter of resignation from Selwyn, never submitted. The final line read, "I have lived too long among ghosts pretending to be colleagues." It was not bitterness. It was a kind of tired honesty, the sort that emerges only when a man no longer intends to argue. Lewis joined me as the light faded. He had found something as well, a visitor's log from the college gatehouse, weeks before the death. A name written in an unfamiliar hand, then crossed out. W. Harker, the dean, visiting after hours. I asked if he'd questioned him. He said yes. The dean had claimed it was about faculty restructuring. I said nothing, but we both knew what sort of structure that conversation must have truly concerned. That night I took out the crossword again. It had become a habit, that grid of ink and silence. I stared at one final clue Selwyn had left blank. The price of forgetting, 7 letters. I wrote silence, then erased it, then loyalty, then, finally, absence. It fit in a way none of the others did. The past, when it returns, rarely demands revenge, only recognition. And Selwyn, I think, had recognized it too late. Some truths come too early, and some arrive just on time. Too late to help, but in time to ruin what little certainty you've gathered. The worst, though, are the ones that feel like endings but aren't. They dress themselves in logic, quote the right lines, answer the clues, and still they're wrong. I'd begun to believe it was Margaret. The lie wasn't in what she said, but in what she withheld. Her grief had been too quiet, her distance too composed. Not the absence of feeling, but the careful containment of it. As if mourning were a performance she'd been cast in once before and remembered all the lines. Lewis had his doubts. He said there was no motive, no money, no threat. Just an estranged sister with a cottage full of unopened books and more silence than furniture. But I remembered the inscription in the Horace volume. As agreed, no further debts. I remembered Selwyn's resignation letter, unsigned. I remembered Margaret standing by the fireplace, still gloved even when the room was warm. We called her in, not formally. A conversation, we said. She arrived without protest in the same coat she'd worn at the funeral. She removed her gloves slowly, like someone unwrapping a memory. I asked if she'd seen the letter. She said no. She said she wouldn't have wanted to. She said she hadn't been close to Adrian in years. Not since the trusteeship dispute, not since he'd made it clear that loyalty was a currency he no longer accepted. I asked what the letter might have said, had it been finished. She said she didn't know. Then she said perhaps it was meant for her, that he had intended to ask forgiveness, or to confess, or simply to explain. Then she paused, said she had torn up something. Not the letter, but a note. A line in his handwriting, left outside her door the morning before he died. She had thrown it in the fire, unread. She said she didn't want apologies. She wanted to forget. I wanted to believe it was her. The shape of the story fit. The old resentment, the buried connection, the moment of weakness disguised as strength. I even wrote it out. The theory, the logic, the motive. It was only later, as I sat with the crossword one last time, that the flaw showed itself. The final clue? Truth withheld at the center of loyalty. 5 letters. I'd written honor once. Then heart, but neither settled. Then I stared longer at the word liege, one of Selwyn's earliest entries. A word that suggests allegiance, yes, but also dominion. A bond that is not chosen, but inherited. And at the center of liege, not metaphorically, but literally, was I.E. I remembered Claire Morton's annotation in the Petrarch volume, the one that simply read, 21st October, the day before the death. I remembered the old visitor's log, the name crossed out, M. Rossi, not Margaret, Morton. I remembered, too, her silence. Not the silence of shock, but of decision. It wasn't Margaret. She had burned a note, not a man. The false solution had felt right because I'd needed it to be. I closed the crossword. Outside, the wind scraped across the panes. The quad below stood empty, its geometry dark and undisturbed. Lewis would want to follow it up, ask questions, confirm timelines. But some clues only matter once you've stopped looking for them, and some solutions, no matter how neatly they fit, are only ever the rehearsal for something else. Confession rarely arrives like thunder. It does not crash into the room with remorse or righteousness. It is quieter than that, like an old door pushed open by wind or a chair that shifts when no one is sitting in it. And it rarely tells the whole story. I asked Claire Morton to meet me not in the station nor in the college, but in the little garden behind the Ashmolean, the one where benches lean under the weight of ivy and the air carries more memory than scent. She arrived as I expected, unsmiling, unhurried, with a scarf wrapped too tightly around her neck despite the weak warmth of the afternoon sun. There was something classical in her posture, a stillness that felt sculpted. She sat without waiting to be asked. I told her I had read her marginalia. She said nothing. I said I had found her name in Selwyn's library record and in the gate ledger, crossed out in a different hand. Still nothing. I told her about the letter, the unfinished one, the crossword, the books that were never quite hers. She looked down then, as if the gravel beneath her shoes might offer a different kind of answer. I asked her how long she had known Selwyn. She said he was her father. The words didn't arrive with pain, they arrived with fatigue. A truth carried too long, perhaps, no longer seeking an audience. He had known, she said, but never claimed. Not in public, not in writing. He had visited once a year, in borrowed silence, offering scholarships and vague advice. She had grown up watching his name in print more than hearing it aloud. I asked if she hated him. She said that wasn't the right word. She said she had wanted to be seen. Not as a scholar, not as a guest, but simply as his. And when he denied her that, again, when he suggested that even her success was borrowed light, the result of a debt paid in guilt, she said she had stopped caring what he thought of her, but she had rung the bell. She admitted that. Said she had entered the college through the old side gate, the one Selwyn had once shown her as a girl, when he'd pretended to be just a kind man with a fondness for Latin. Said she'd stood beneath the tower, waited for the moment between hours, and pulled the rope once. Not for grief, for warning. I asked if she had killed him. She looked at me for a long time, then said no. But she had thought about it. She had brought a vial of something. Digitalis, extracted from a lab kit left carelessly open in the pharmacology block. She had brought it in her coat pocket, but she hadn't used it, because he had looked at her that last night and said nothing. Not denial, not anger, not fear, just nothing. And in that moment she said he had already gone. She had left the vial on his desk, unopened, hidden beneath a stack of lectures he would never read again. I believed her, perhaps because she had said it not as defense but as resignation. I asked what she wanted now. She said to leave. I said that was not always possible. She nodded, stood, and walked toward the gates without another word. That evening I returned to my crossword. One final clue. The absence that lingers after silence. 6 letters. I tried echo. Too short. Then guilt. Wrong shape. Eventually, I wrote father and closed the book. The cloister bell rang once more the morning after her departure. Just once. Not for mourning. Not officially. There had been no announcement, no black-ribboned note on the gate, no footsteps gathering in chapel silence. But I heard it. Low, deliberate, unhurried. Some porter, no doubt, testing the rope or mistaking a tradition for necessity. Or perhaps someone remembered what it was for. Perhaps Claire, from a distance, had wanted a final word without speech. A ritual goodbye, clutched from a city that had never quite said hello. The case, if it ever truly was one, closed itself gently. There would be no prosecution, no autopsy revised, no headlines, only a quiet agreement to let things remain unpolished. Oxford is good at that. Lewis asked me, later that week, if I believed her. I said belief wasn't the point. I think he knew what I meant, or pretended to. Sometimes I prefer his silence to his certainty. He left the room without asking more. I stayed. Selwyn's crossword remained on my desk, folded now, softened by the days I'd carried it, unfinished, not because I couldn't complete it, but because something in me didn't want to. Some puzzles are not meant to be solved, only considered. The clue still waiting, that which lingers after confession, 6 letters. I had tried remorse. Too long, tether too vague. But that morning, after the bell, it came to me. Shadow, it fit. Not just the grid, but the mood, the case, the man, the city. Selwyn had left a shadow in his silence, in the people who moved around him, in the daughter who had carried his name without ever being allowed to say it aloud. And perhaps in me too. I remembered him once. Years ago, long before the death. Standing in the Sheldonian, muttering quietly to himself during a particularly dull lecture on Ovid. I'd passed behind him and heard the words before I recognized the voice. He'd said, not knowing I was near, "Truth is a structure we build from omissions." At the time, I'd thought it pretentious. Now, I'm not so sure. I returned the crossword to the envelope and slid it into a drawer I rarely open. Then I poured the last of the Glenfarclas and watched the sun try to rise through the fog. It didn't quite succeed. Oxford stood grey, half-formed, like a place between decisions. Somewhere, across the city, another bell began to ring. Lighter this time. Church or wedding, I couldn't say. But the cloister bell had said what it needed to, and I, for once, had no questions left.